You know, it's really hard to know how to aim this kind of talk because you never really know where people are. And so I'm going for, let's remind people of what GDPR actually is, because as you said, it was a big topic, as it's still, maybe not really. I'm going to remind people like what it is and some like practical things as devs, like what you might think about when trying to protect user data. And then maybe a slightly different look at why you should care about it, besides being fined. So without further ado, let's get going, because there's quite a lot. So first off, disclaimer, I'm not a GDPR expert. I'm good at other things in life, but I am not a lawyer. That'll be one at the end as well. So I work at a company called Elastic, as we make a open source data store for searching and analytics called Elasticsearch. And we also provide application performance monitoring, which is very relevant here. But actually, while you can do a lot there, to whitelist and blacklist different fields and like manage the data that you're storing, and we'll touch on that later. First, let's talk about GDPR itself. So GDPR has kind of metastasized in a bit of a cultural artifact. This is almost a bit of trauma among technologists when you talk about GDPR nowadays. So this is a joke that I really want to share with you to start off with. Alice asked Bob, "Can you recommend me a GDPR expert?" "Yes," says Bob. "Oh, great. Can you give me their email address so I can contact them?" "No, of course not. That's GDPR. So, of course, this is extremely unfunny, but that is kind of the point. So GDPR is something that's extremely boring to most people. And the only way we ever hear about it is in relation to how we're going to get fined. So talk about it. If you have any questions, just drop them using the Zoom Q&A tools, and we'll have a session after the talk where I'll go through your questions and probably fail to answer most of them, but such is life. I'll do my best. Okay, so GDPR stands for the General Data Protection Regulation. It was adopted back in 2016, which I think still surprises some people. It became enforceable in 2018. But yeah, it's been enforceable for 2 years. It covers EU organizations as well as anybody who is interacting with EU citizens. So like if you are working for a US org, then it still covers you. And it covers services and goods for monitoring EU citizens and for keeping their data. So given that this is a UK meetup, basically, yes, it applies to you. No, nobody knows what will happen after Brexit. Nobody knows what will happen to any other aspects of the country after Brexit. We might go back to data protection law. There is some speculation about that, but in reality, nobody knows, so I'm not going to spend any time speculating either. Now, the interesting thing about GDPR is that it's not just a paper tiger. Like a lot of other regulation, some substantial fines, and there's 2 tiers of fines, up to 10 million euros and up to 20, or respectively in each tier, up to a percentage of the turnover, 2% or 4%. So notice I said of turnover, not profit, of turnover. So if you're running on a small margin and you do some bad things with users' privacy, then this might hit you quite badly. It might even push you into loss. Right? So this is turnover, just the amount of money that the company is taking in, rather than profit after expenses. Now, some like relevant UK examples of companies, companies that have been fined. We've got EXPERIAN as an interesting one. Is only fined 500K for the enormous data breach that is super notorious. And the reason was that it was fined under the old Data Protection Act, the DPA. And that was the maximum fine back then. Right? But British Airways and Marriott together fined just about 300 million. So this is quite a big difference there. So you can see that it has been given some teeth. There's a funny case that our own Crown Prosecution Service was fined, I think, 325K because it left unencrypted DVDs with police recordings lying around. And yes, so I was kind of hoping that we might have real-time chat, but since we only have Q&A, I'll just tell you the last one. The amount that Facebook was fined for Cambridge Analytica. Well, if we can make it interesting, think about a number. Just pick a number in your head. How much do you think they were fined for the super notorious Cambridge Analytica scandal, election manipulation, and so on? Drum roll, it was 500K because the violation was at least reported and detected in December 2015. So prosecuted under the DPA, or at least the ICO looked into it under the DPA, Office of the Information Commissioner. So that was it. Yeah, this is very disappointing, but this is exactly why we have GDPR. All right, so what does it cover? It's personal data, meaning any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. So companies not protected by this. Now there is also a more sensitive personal data tier. So if, when you're writing web apps, if you're processing things like race, sex, gender, trade union membership, and a few other things, and I'll give you a good place where to get this list, better than listening to talk. For those things, for sex, trade union membership, and so on, your protections should be stricter. So either way, like even if it's the simpler personal data or the more sensitive one, this will include things like server logs, and it will include stuff like your marketing campaigns and so on. Okay, but so what rights do people actually get? You have the right to be informed. So you must tell, well, you as a web app operator, you must tell individuals how and why you're collecting data. They have right of access. You must let people know how you're using their data and allow them to check you're doing it legally. They have right to rectification. If you've made a mistake in someone's data, you must correct it if they contact you. Then there's a couple more, is erasure, the right to be forgotten. So that's, they request you to delete data about them, and that can be a bit painful, especially if you have data stored in various places in your system, like if you have a service-oriented architecture and everything depends on everything else in terms of records, and you store data across multiple data stores. But we'll touch on an interesting way to handle that Spotify did a bit later. So another right, to restrict processing. You can still store the data, but an individual can ask you to stop using it. This would be an enormous pain for most of us. To be honest, I don't dig into this in this talk. This is, you would have to basically set a flag and attempt to stop processing the record as much as possible. And I would guess that if a lot of people might choose to implement this as delete, simply, because it would be really difficult to do it in any other way in most of the architectures that I've participated in building, at least as an engineer. So then finally, so this is sixth right, we got 8 rights. Yes, the sixth right is the right to data portability. People must be able to get hold of the data you hold on them and then be able to use it elsewhere. I think we haven't really even started dealing with this properly. At the moment, from what I've seen practically, just CSV export, and you give it to them and they go, well, I hope you can use this elsewhere. A lot of apps don't offer this at all, including huge companies. So yeah, got a long way to go. The right to object. If you're using someone's data for marketing or research purposes, they can ask you to stop. We all know that one. That's kind of, I guess, made it particularly famous. Automatic decision making. So if you're doing automatic profiling and machine learning and so on, then you need to tell them that you are doing it, and they have a right to know how you're doing it. So if they explicitly agreed to it, then that's fine. So then you've got this lawful use of data. And so I'm aware that there's a list of things, but There isn't really any better way to talk about the regulation, and I want to put it at the top of your minds. The only like particularly interesting thing for us here is contractual obligation. So you need to use the data in order to deliver a service that the person asked you for, or that they're considering. So like, I guess if you're offering them a quote for something like insurance, for example. So informed consent, contractual obligation, this is where most of you will be playing in. Legitimate interest is quite vague. It allows you to use the data if the legitimate interests of your company require it, and you can show that that balances with the rights of the individuals. I'd stick to, and I have stuck to, informed consent and contractual obligation. What data are you processing? Like, what fields exactly are you requiring from users? Where are you going to use them? And does that relate in like, what they expect from your service? So if you go kind of behind their backs and start, like aggregating, selling, doing other things with their data that they don't think would be very obvious to them, then you're on thinner ground, okay? So these are not so interesting. So then you need to prove that you are legally using the data and that your use is staying within the lawful use. And this is for every data process that you have, by the way. So for smaller companies, it's not like it'd be ISO compliant or something and you have all of your processes written down. But basically make a list of all the information flows in your app. And if you're exporting data and giving to other people, other apps, if you're allowing users to download data, just make a list of all of these. Because this is what people can question you on. And certainly if you get audited, that is what they would question you on. So an important point, quick to mention, disclosure needs to be within, if there is a data breach, you need to disclose to supervisory body. For us, this is the Office of the Information Commissioner or the ICO. So you need to write to them immediately. Okay, if you have legacy data that doesn't comply with the GDPR, which actually a lot of people do, it's nothing shameful or embarrassing about it, you need to stop using it, check that you can make it compliant with the GDPR, and if you cannot, delete it. That's it. Okay, so what do people do if they are not sure that they have legal grounds, or or if they don't have legal grounds? Some of the more interesting cases. So one thing is to just lock people out. You're probably seeing these blockers on US websites. So like people in Europe kind of generally seem to react with, well, if you were doing something so dodgy that you need to block me, then I'd rather not use your service. And people in the US are like, well, this is a way to really show the regulators who's boss. This is still ongoing, like this butting of heads. It is what it is. And personally, I kind of find the right to privacy more important. So another thing people do is just simply drown people in forms. It's like cookie permissions, for example. So if you're always clicking accept and you're trying to work around it with privacy terms, I obviously review your privacy terms with a lawyer if you can afford one. Most startups can't to the depth that they need to, so they just scrape by or use templates. I wouldn't really do this. If you are worried about GDPR compliance, don't try to work around it. Just try to reduce the data that you are using. Just sit down, look at your database columns and think about, why are we storing this? Where are we requiring this? Like usually at registration, why are we requiring it? Where are we going to actually use it? You will be surprised. I was surprised, certainly, when I did reviews back in 2018. There is a lot of stuff you can drop and you don't need it. You think you might need it, and this is exactly what the regulation is supposed to do, to encourage you to drop. You do not need it. You can always reintroduce the fields. I promise it will not be particularly painful for you. Okay, so the third thing people do is pseudo-anonymization. So what's anonymous info is information that can't identify an individual. Pseudo-anonymous is re-identification is possible, but you need to combine it with extra information. And without that extra information, then re-ID is basically impossible. So since I work at a search company, we thought of, okay, like at what, how could people do pseudo-anonymization? And there's either a write time, we call ingestion time, or a retrieval time, what we might call search time. Just do it at write time. So they don't try to anonymize things kind of on the fly. You can if you're really in a pinch, but generally just don't store the data. That's my main message in the first place, because there's also a data breach, and like doing it on the fly doesn't help you in the case of a data breach. So, okay, so something particularly specific. All right, so this is with logging, and that would apply to a lot of other things you might store in a data store for monitoring purposes. So you can see up here, we've got a pseudo anonymized index. So the IP is a hash, and so is the username. And then we just have another index where we connect the hash of the username, the hash of the IP with the actual values. So what's a possible problem with that? Here's the config for this. So this was, by the way, this is Logstash, which is a open source project that Elastic makes, and it allows you to process your logs. And it has plenty of other stuff like that from other vendors. So this is its config. And the interesting thing here is that it's relatively simple to do, which is good to note. There's not really an excuse not to do it, but the interesting thing here is the hash. It's SHA-256. So if you've dealt with storing passwords for a while, you recognize that that's probably not a great algorithm to use for storing passwords, because it's very fast. It's designed to be extremely fast, meaning you can reverse it really quickly. So it doesn't really offer you enough protection. And this is a service which can enrich data with, it even enriches data with other known records. And it just runs, it computes hashes. I think it was like 4 cents per email to reverse compute the hash. So from what you saw, just this hash, this jumble of digits and letters, from what you saw back in the Logstash config, actually you can retrieve the email. And so this is the maybe not embarrassing, but kind of interesting part. So Logstash in particular, actually, like the plugin for it that allows you to do fingerprint filtering, does a number of hashing algorithms, including SHA-512, but it doesn't do hashing algorithms which are fast and still prevent reversal, like bcrypt, which is something that you would use nowadays for passwords. There is actually, as far as I know, not really a good way to do pseudo-anonymization. So I know that, of course, you might prefer if I give you a straight answer for this. The answer, if you do want to do pseudo-anonymization, is to simply do it at the application level, or you can write your own Logstash plugin because it supports custom plugins. But of course, you're not going to sit down and do that. So my point here is that you can't do this in Elasticsearch or with Logstash. My point is you're probably not doing this with any data store that you're using. So if you are doing pseudo-anonymization, be very careful what algorithm you're using. As far as I can tell, bcrypt and with whatever is good for passwords is what you should use, and you should use a salted one. Otherwise, it may be better if you don't store the data or store it in a different tier. So for example, if you are gonna do pseudonymization, as in store store the pseudonymized index in something that's more accessible, and your identity storage should have much more restricted read capabilities, right? So you need to set your security groups and so on properly for that. So that's how I would focus on doing it. Don't rely on the fact that it is pseudonymization. So you need to rely on access control and on encryption. And also be wary of encryption, because if your data is encrypted, it says, your data store says it's encrypted, or it offers encryption, but unless you're the one holding the keys for the asymmetric cryptography required for it, then you're not protecting the data. And there's actually a lot of, I don't know, I guess it's not really snake oil, but it's kind of trying to reassure you. But in reality, just like with pseudonymization, you might think you're protecting the data. In actual fact, you're not really. So then another way to deal with it is, sorry, taking a second, going back. We talked about users' right to ask for their data to be deleted, right? Okay, so this is the interesting idea. If you encrypt the data, you can just get rid of the private key, and then that's it. So there's a really interesting article that removes access to that data across different services. There is a really interesting article by Spotify that they basically do a different set of keys for each user, which I guess must take them some compute, but it is quite a good idea. Like, at least I can't see obvious problems with it. Even if the data set leaks, they also need the decryption keys, right? And also, if they get a request, yeah, they just delete the key pair, and that's it. Like, the conclusion is actually quite long here, but in conclusion, when you are storing data in your data stores, think carefully about what you're storing. Reconsider again and again for every piece of information whether you need to store it, and lean towards not storing it. You will not need it. This is a natural thing for product managers, people in product to do. You will not need it, trust me. It is the new norm for approaching data, or at least I think it's trying to lay the foundations for a new way of approaching privacy and personal data. And this is a really good flowchart that I found is super clear. So if your data is properly anonymized, not pseudo-anonymized, then you've got no problems. If you have consent or a legitimate basis to collect the data, then you are fine, but be careful about how you're storing it. And for the personally identifiable information and the sensitive personal and the special category sensitive information, put it in a separate data store, or put it in a separate cluster or separate nodes of your data store, and restrict access to that severely. But anyway, if you want to take a screen grab of that, this is, like, in my experience with it, this is actually quite a good way to think about it. So again, final reminder, I'm not a lawyer. Now a tiny bit about, so we're doing for time, about 5 minutes, okay. A tiny bit about my own experience. So I used to run a small dev agency and slash consultancy. Generally, when we build a website for someone, we generally determine that our clients were the data controllers in GDPR, which means that they set the policy of what should be done with the data. And we made sure that that was the case. We made them aware that we see them in that role, and we asked them for what they want the privacy policy to be, and we asked them to think through that. But when we wanted to run a SaaS service ourselves at one point. We tried to build product for universities. When we became data controllers, even though actually in practice our clients were so big that they basically told us what the requirements were and we just had to comply. Generally, if you were in doubt about whether you're a data controller or a data processor, because I have spent, I guess, weeks debating this, I would err on the side of more responsibility. Yes, it might be a bit more difficult for you and may make things a bit more expensive in terms of time and effort, but it's worth doing. And we'll talk in a second about why it's worth doing. Now, as happens with these things, as I said, I'm not a lawyer or a particular expert, but I care about the topic and I want people to think about this when we're building. I want this to be, just like accessibility, I want this to be one of the fundamental things that we think about, user privacy and how we use data and why we're collecting it. So I try to bring this to people, to different dev communities. But having said that, so I knew about Heather Burns, so she's really good on the topic of privacy. I've read her work for years now, but I hadn't read this particular article by her. So take a screen grab, or later, of course, you will be able to get it from the slides. It's an amazing blog post. It's super clear on like exactly on the rights, on what kind of data is considered like problematic, on what you should do and what you should be more sensitive to. It's very balanced, and yeah, I mean, I only discovered it today because this is how these things go. But I guess my job is not necessarily to feel more competent myself. My job is to bring you something useful. So overall, regulations are everywhere. So if you are having to deal with it, don't panic. Like even a simple coffee cart comes with legal implications, as in like a physical one. At the moment, we're not really into those. But you've got food safety laws, commercial operation laws, municipal laws, employment law. So it's fine. Tech is actually not subject to that much regulation. Try to do the right thing, educate yourself, and you'll be fine. Don't handle it like this. This is really funny. If you see at the bottom of that screenshot, so this is by Zoom. This is a while back now. Yes or yes. Would you like to opt in? Yes, definitely. Or yes, but only for less email. Okay, so why should you care about this? I suppose my actual conclusion, really. In life, in general, we care about things for, well, one framework of thinking about it is that we care about things for two reasons. Because we have a stick hanging over our heads, or that's gonna, smack us, or we have a carrot dangling in front of us. And I've talked a lot about the stick, the fines, and there's a lot of boring topics. And like I've just gone through a list of things, because no matter what you do, there's always a list of things that you have to care about when it comes to regulation. So personally, I want to be like a good person, I guess, and an upstanding citizen. But why is that just so boring? And it is all about framing. So Europe is really densely populated, and we just can't help but stick our nose in each other's business. It is kind of silly to think that, okay, maybe your local hair salon could expose your email address in a breach, and that's a bit. We get it as devs because we've had this GDPR thing really drilled into our heads. But what is really the impact of that? But data protection law comes from a much more serious legacy in Europe of privacy violation and data gathering. So this is where GODWIN comes in. You've obviously, sorry, not obviously, that's the wrong word to use there. You've probably all heard of the use of census data back in the late 30s in a certain Western European country, Germany, by the Nazi regime. It was processed for storage earlier by IBM. So census data was gathered earlier, and they almost certainly did not expect it to be used the way it was later. So in my personal opinion, that purely that, sometimes to make a business decision, we have to invoke emotion, right, as well as fact. And if you want to invoke anything other than boredom and fines when thinking about data protection, then I would try to invoke a sense of duty towards people's privacy and build systems and businesses which really respect that privacy. Only collect the data you need, question if you need pieces of it each time you add a piece that you collect, and question that at the product design stage. Only store data as long as you need it. So think about also retiring data and deleting it. You can retire it or delete it to an encrypted archive as well. Well, you can retire it to an encrypted archive, rather. If you collected something earlier and you want to retire that functionality, just drop the data. So this is my opinion as a web dev, and that's, in my opinion, in the spirit of the GDPR regulation. And that's something that's just, I guess, more noble and better than just thinking about the fines, and it can give you a reason to go and read that blog post by Heather and go through these things and spend several hours actually educating yourself if you haven't spent that time so far.